right, since it's we're just on the hour right now, what I'm going to do is actually just kick this off since we have a lot to fit into this webinar today. What we're going to be doing is walking through the entire process, start to finish, of creating an image in KeyShot. This does not necessarily include render time, but again, this is going to be focused on a high-level, broad strokes view at how you can move through KeyShot to build a nice image. It's definitely going to be geared toward beginners or people who are newer to KeyShot. However, if you have been using it for a little while, I do think you'll get a few tips and tricks out of it, especially when you look at speed, efficiency, things like that. So without further ado, I will mention I'm Will Gibbons. I'm the Global Training Specialist at Luxion. And today I'm going to be taking you through how to create an image start to finish. All right, so before we kick this off, I am going to mention that I am recording this. It will become live on our YouTube channel in the near future. And the computer I'm working on, since that seems to be a common question, actually today is an older MacBook Pro. One of the beautiful things about KeyShot is you do not need a beast of a machine to get great results. And while recording this and performing a webinar and rendering in KeyShot today on a laptop should hopefully prove that true. So if you guys have questions during this webinar, feel free to type those in the chat box. We have a couple of Luxion employees on the line. Hopefully they can answer your questions as they come up. Anything that's relevant to what we're doing today will be held as a question that I can answer at the end of the webinar. But we have a lot to get through, like I said, so I'm going to move fairly quickly, and it might take a little bit. So here we go. The topics of our webinar today is going to be focused on, again, I said those broad strokes, the major chunks, the steps I take when I go to create an image. Again, focused on trying to get as much done in as little time as possible. It's easy to get caught up in those details. So what we're going to do is go first with a block in where we kind of set up our scene. And then we will take a look at lighting. And then once we like the way our scene is lit, we're going to work on materials. And then we leave the details for the final adjustments stage. So let's say all of a sudden we don't have as much time as we thought to actually finish or take our rendering to completion. We at least have the broad strokes taken care of. That's why I like to break it down like this. And then, of course, we will talk about basic render settings for the scene that I walk us through. And then we will hopefully have time for some Q&A afterward. So the first step for our block in here, we're going to kind of look at three things. First off, we'll import our model, and then we'll use model sets to organize our scene if necessary. I think because we're working on such a simple scene and we don't have a ton of time today, we might not get into too much model set work. But then we'll also be using primitives to create a setting. So rather than just having your product floating in space, it's sometimes nice to situate it or add context. So we'll talk about how to do that in KeyShot. And then creating a couple of potential camera angles and then deciding on the one to proceed with. So I'm going to go ahead and open KeyShot 7. And then we have on our desktop, the model that I'll be working with today is just a step file. I'll drag it into the KeyShot real-time window. And our import settings look good, nothing crazy here. The only things I changed is I turned off separate materials by part, and I have import NURBS data just in case I want to play with tessellation later. I'll go ahead and hit import. And here we go. So our model is quite simple, modeled in Fusion 360. This is a power bank. You use it to charge mobile devices, things like that. So pretty simple form. And what I'm going to do is start by, so it looks like I already have a 16:9 aspect ratio laid out. So if I didn't, for some reason, if my view is like this when I started, my real-time view, what I would likely do as one of the first steps is go and set that aspect ratio to something I want to work with. For me, it's 16:9 because this is, you know, standard kind of aspect ratio of digital screens and stuff like that. All right, so then the next thing that we'll do is we're going to kind of situate our product. Again, this looks like it's sitting on the ground. That's okay, but I'd like to go for something a little bit more interesting. And I'll show you. I actually found an image that I'm so sorry, I'm not quite sure who this is from or where this came from online. But I thought this had a cool aesthetic that was something we could aim for, something similar. I don't want to create the same image, but just something that's a bit interesting and plays with a full range of values. So value meaning the bright areas to dark areas. So I think this looks kind of cool. So we'll do something sort of like that. It's always nice to have a reference. So in order to do that, we'll go ahead and I'm going to go to Edit, Add Geometry, and I'm going to add a cube. All right, so we get a little cube in our scene. I want to scale this up, so I can turn on the scale handle and just click and drag on the yellow box to scale this up. I can snap it to the ground, and I'll hit the green checkbox. Next, I want to put my product on top of it, so I'll grab the Move tool, lift it up, and then I'll just click Snap to Lower Object. And then I'll move my product, oopsies, wrong one. Let's do it again, Snap to Lower Object. I'll grab the planar move handle and just bring this up toward the edge of my cube. Maybe rotate this a little bit so it's just not super perfect. And we could go ahead and do that, continue to do that. We could add more. If you look in our Edit, Add Geometry window, we have quite a few options, whether it's a ground plane or a backdrop, a couple other shapes we can add just for interest, for visual interest. For now, I'm going to keep things simple. Also, that has to do with the time constraints of our webinar. We don't have a ton of time. So the next thing I'm going to do is kind of consider a kind of a composition. So how everything is framed up in our window. So you'll notice as I get close, we're getting a lot of convergence of the vertical lines of this cube. That comes from having a fairly wide camera angle, so, or a camera lens. So if I change this to 100 from my perspective, you'll notice this cube kind of flattens out and the verticals get closer to being parallel. We are going to, or I would usually adjust that fairly early on, just because it allows me to kind of compose my scene, get nice and close without getting far too much distortion on my object. So as I kind of bring the camera in a little bit closer, I'm thinking about what that final shot might look like. I could do something kind of like this if I wanted to. I don't want my product centered in the frame or anything like that, but this would be kind of a cool close-up for kind of a macro shot. So I can go to my cameras and I can save off a camera at that position if I want to consider that for the future. I can also hunt around for a few more angles. So I can do something that, you know, shows off more of the profile of this kind of slim geometric product. If I want to show off this edge, I could do something sort of like this. I could save off another camera angle. If I want one that's kind of more top down, say I'm going to show off like a texture or a cool design on the top of this, or maybe a branding or something, a logo, I could do something like this. Let's see. And sometimes it's just a matter of playing around to finding what your eye finds pleasing. Like I kind of like something sort of like this. So I'll save this as the third potential option. So I have these to play with. I'm not married to any of them yet, but we'll land on one eventually. I think I kind of like this last one. So if we move on over to our slideshow, we considered creating a model set. Right now, with just a simple single product and just a primitive in my scene, I don't think it's necessary to add model sets. But if I had maybe a couple different versions, or I wanted two of these product in my scene and I want them to be kind of independent of one another, I could add them to the model sets section. So if this is something that is new to you, we have other videos we can link up that show how to use model sets. And then also going back here, we use primitives to create our setting, and then a couple camera angles. So the next step is lighting. What I want to do is explore a couple of off-the-shelf HDRIs and see if one of them works for us. And then if it doesn't, or if we want to add some more drama, we can add physical planes or lights for more directional or dramatic lighting. And then finally, I want to kind of, between the two of those, assess what we have and see which one I like the best, and then proceed, and then we'll move on to the next phase. So let's do that. If I go ahead and grab an environment, I can go ahead and leave this at the default, but you'll notice we lack contrast. It's kind of boring. But if I play around with a different environment, like say this hallway one, you'll see it gets kind of darker. We have some shadows. I can go into my environment settings and try rotating it. The shortcut for this, by the way, is Command or Control and left click drag. By knowing that shortcut, you can always change your lighting without moving into this tab. So I recommend you memorize that one. So I'm not liking this. It doesn't have enough contrast for my preferences. So if I try the bathroom scene, you wouldn't normally think of shooting a product in the bathroom, but check this out. Yeah, so because this has a really bright window, we've got a pretty strong directional lighting here. So I can kind of get like a really bright side to the cube as well as the product, which I think is really cool. It's going to give us more of what we're after. We could backlight it, but I'm thinking something almost like this. And again, we got to remember, we still have a couple camera angles, but I'm pretty sure we're going to proceed with this last one. I just have a good feeling about it. So back in our environment, so we've got this bathroom, which could work. We could play with the brightness if we wanted to. We'll go ahead and just leave that at the default for now. I want to do another thing I mentioned, which was consider physical lights. There's definitely some benefits, and there are some videos floating around online about those that we could probably link up. But if I go ahead and add a plane to my scene, I can use that as a physical light. So what I'll do is I'll go to Edit, Add Geometry, and we're going to add a plane. And we don't see it here on the screen. I would need to move away, and then I can grab it and drag it up so it's now visible above my cube. So now I want to snap back to my camera angle. So you see how my camera, I didn't bother locking it because sometimes I want to change my camera view. But if we just navigate off it and go back, it's back to where it was. So I kind of like that behavior, that I can move my camera and then it doesn't automatically save. It's quite nice. So now what about moving that light plane without constantly moving my camera angle? Well, we can open the geometry view. I'll go to Window and open the geometry view. And we should see it pop up on the left. Yeah, so it's stacked on top of my library panel. If I scroll out though, I can bring into view my scene, and now we're kind of this third person looking into the scene, which is cool. And we see our plane. So let's get our plane. I'm gonna move it. I'm gonna just drag it over, kind of give it a bit of a rotation. And here's a cool thing. What we can do is, if we want to move this light, but kind of keep it focused on our product, I can change the pivot or the of this move tool. So I'll click pick, I'll choose my product, and I'll hit OK. And now my move tool's on the product itself. And when I move it, we'll see that the light kind of moves and rotates around my object, which is super cool. I'll leave it there for now. I'll double click on the plane to turn it into a light material. Go for an area light, my favorite. I like how they give this nice kind of fall off, and I don't know, just has a look that I think often works quite well with product shots. It's too bright, of course. That's because I'm too close. So I'm going to move my plane further away. And it may be because my light itself is too bright. So we'll have to check that out. But now you can see as I move it, I can move this around my scene and it stays focused on the product. All right, we'll leave it there for now. Also, I'm going to save this. We don't like crashes, and you never know when that's going to happen. So I'll go ahead and just save this to my desktop. All right. Good. Okay. So now I want to, it's a little bit bright. if I go back to my environment, something I want to show you, if I take my HDRI and start dropping its brightness, we can inject some drama into our scene. And it does two things. One, it keeps my scene from being blown out because now I don't have too much light in my scene, and it makes those shadows nice and dark. Now, if I take it down to nothing, this does not look good. We're clipping, we're getting too much black, it's too dark. So what I like to do is actually use both physical lights and HDRIs, and I tend to use my HDRIs as fill light to keep the dark areas from getting too dark. So we can just play with them and let them work together. All right, so let's take a look at our presentation. So we checked out some HDRIs, or one in particular we stuck with, and then we added a plane to see if we could get more directional lighting. We got that. I think I'm going to use the combination of both HDRI and physical light because I think they suit this shot pretty well. So the next step is materials. And this is where you can end up spending a lot of time. So we want to kind of, again, focus on moving through this quickly. So I'll start by applying basic materials. And by basic, I mean kind of straight out of the KeyShot library. And then I'll spend time dialing in a couple textures and labels. And then we have this cool thing, multi-materials, that is an awesome kind of last step that I use to try a few different color options or different finish variations. And then we can kind of, just like we did a few different camera angles and then decided which one we liked afterward, we can do the same thing with materials. And then we can proceed with that, that option. So that's kind of like a nice way to use KeyShot through the development phase before you know exactly what you're going to end up with. So, I mean, this looks pretty cool already, but let's go ahead and get some materials on here. So I switch over to my library tab, and now I can go into materials and just search for what I want. Black plastic is my go-to. It's kind of just a habit, but I like to start off with very basic materials all the time. And by working with something dark like black plastic, it allows me to see all my textures and stuff quite well. So I'll drag some of these on here. Looks like we have another black part here. I'm gonna drag that onto. And then we've got our cube, which is just a diffuse material, which I might leave as a diffuse, we'll see. But what I wanna do is just change it from black, or sorry, this blue color to black. But you'll notice it's too dark. Avoid pure black. I would say if I want it very dark, I can go with a 10%. Maybe even 15 is better for now. And then we'll notice the thing looks kind of blue. It's kind of because my light, that plane that has the light material, that's actually a blue color. I don't want it to be blue, so let's make it white for now. Okay, and then we could have some color influence from our HDRI. If we did not want that, if this had too much warm and then cool light, so you see how we're getting cool blue on the front here and then warm yellow on the top here, it's from these two light sources in here. I can hit my HDRI editor tab, choose that background image, and then all I need to do is go to my saturation, dial this back a little bit. So, I mean, I could just desaturate the whole thing, and that may be what I do for now. There we go. And then it looks like I need something on this button, so I'll go back with the textured black plastic, looking pretty good. Good enough for now. What are these guys? These are a rough plastic, that's fine. Okay, so if I go into my scene, what I wanna make sure is that these three things are not linked to anything else. I'm just gonna go ahead and isolate materials to selection. Okay, very good. So next I want to throw on some textures. So right here, we teased out this image of this power bank that I created a few weeks ago. I'm gonna follow that pretty similarly. I'm gonna go to my textures. It looks like we have a bump on here already. I'm gonna kill that for now. We might come back to it. But what I wanna do is start off putting a texture in the diffuse channel, and I do this to help me see what I'm working with. If I go, I'm gonna use a procedural texture, which you get from this drop-down menu, pardon me. And I'm gonna choose the mesh, which is a really powerful texture that we can customize to create different kind of mesh patterns. And I'm gonna stick with lines today. I mean, dots are cool, but I've got these rounded edges, and I know that projecting a round texture onto these kind of rounded edges could be problematic for me. So because this model is not prepped with UV mapping, so I'm going to go ahead and switch this to something like lines, which will do just fine, projecting all the way through that curved kind of edge. And then I'm going to take the color background, color and background, and turn one of them to be white, so it's kind of high contrast. Now you can see it's projecting box mapped. We don't want that. I want it projecting as if it's just projecting all the way through this. So I'll change it from mesh to normal, or sorry, excuse me. I'll change it from box mapping type to planar. And now it looks like it's projecting all the way through. I'll center it on the part. And if I hit the move texture button, we see our move tool. Let's turn on the translate handles, turn off rotate. I'll leave them on. And then if I hit fit to Y or X or Z, this will take our planar projection and project it along one of those three axes. Y is what I want because it's going to project normal to the face. And then if I want, I'm going to go ahead and actually just rotate this, maybe 45 degrees. I think this A helps our composition, and B is kind of interesting for kind of a linear product. So go ahead and hit OK. And then we can spend lots of time dialing in this texture, really making, spacing and everything the way we want it. I don't quite have time for that now, so I'm just going to move on. But before I do that, there's something I want to look at, because I'm going to use this for the bump as well. Actually, I'll show you what happens if we do that. If I drag this on a bump, we'll see it's pretty subtle. If I go and take the bump height up to, like, say 3, it's going to look pretty yucky. It does not look very good. And the problem is, if you look here, we have this thing called fall off. It's set to 0. And the fall off controls how sharp this edge is. And that's not so good. As soon as I start dragging it to a larger number, like say 0.5, you'll see it starts to be less sharp. And if I go to 1, it's really soft. So the key here is I'm going to set this to a very low value, say 0.2. And that should give us a fairly kind of crispy bump edge. And it's subtle here, but we'll see it in a bit. I just wanted to call that out, because if this is the first time you've used this texture, that this little fall off guy can be key for making a bump texture with the mesh procedural to look decent. The other thing, or the other way I want to use this, is to break up the shininess or the roughness on this material. Right now our material is rough. If I take it down to glossy or shiny, you can see it a little bit better. Also, I'm going to go back to the geometry view and tweak my light, that plane, just a little bit, so I can get some kind of highlights on the top surface of this. Because if I don't do that, adding a little bit of roughness variation may not come through or not read very well on this product. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and even, I think, put just a little bit more brightness into this light. So I'll set it to about 1500 lumen. All right, so if we go back here and we look at our material graph, and the reason I'm going to go into the material graph is because I want to use this texture on the roughness as well. So let's scoot this window over, pop open the material graph, and now if I take this guy and I plug this mesh texture into the roughness, go to the plus, find roughness, we can see now we're breaking up that surface between glossy and rough. And here's a little trick. If I click on the connector to the roughness, I'm going to add a utility node, going to color to number. This is going to allow us to preview, well, I'm going to hit C while this is selected. Now I'm previewing this texture color information. Now this color to number is going to allow us to control the white and black values independently. So it's too rough because pure white is equal to a roughness level of 1. And I don't want this to be that rough. It's like, it's too rough. So if I bring this down, the white will get darker. If I bring this down to about 0.1, we should be back to a roughness of kind of about 0.1 for the white areas. And then if I left this black at 0, this black will be pure glossy. So if I get out of my preview with the C key, we should hopefully see a difference there. If I change my camera angle, because I'm not seeing a huge difference there. We might be able to see what's happening. But it's definitely going to be dependent a little bit on your lighting. So that's why this can be a little bit tricky. Let me go ahead and go back to that camera, just reset it. And then if I want to go back into the material graph, get a preview on that color to number, I'm going to take the roughness up in the dark areas just a little bit as well. Maybe I'll bring this up a bit here too, just to have some more contrast. And for now, we'll leave this be. Now from this angle, you can see that the roughness, maybe I just had to go a little bit higher here. Now that roughness here is giving us a matte finish on the stripes, which is pretty cool. That's kind of what we're going for. Let's just pump it up for now, and we'll back it down if we need to a little bit later. There we go. Okay, so let's get out of this material graph and continue editing. Next, we want to add some labels, I believe. So if I go ahead and grab my labels, and I have 3 PNGs that I can put as labels on this guy. I'm going to go ahead and start off with my power button. So I'm just going to drag it into KeyShot and onto the part, and I'll add it as a label. And again, I'm going to change my camera angle. And if I go to move my label here, let's see, by default, it looks like it's set to planar mapping mode, and it's set to center on model. I want to center it on the part. And let's go ahead and hit move texture. Let's fit it to either the X, the Y, or the Z. And this looks pretty good, although here's an interesting little insight. Because of the way I modeled this, this part itself does not have its own local X, Y, and Z axes. So what KeyShot's doing is it's just projecting this along KeyShot's global axis. So in order to make this not distort the way it's projecting onto this button, I'm changing my camera angle and allowing me to kind of rotate this to kind of match the angle that this surface was built at. And I'm just going to eyeball it for now. If I really needed that to be precise, I could go about doing it, fixing my model so it had true good global axes, or sorry, local axes. And then at this point, I'm a little bit rotated. So let's go check out my labels angle, and I can hopefully just take this and rotate this guy up to 90. There we go. And let's scale this guy down. All right, and it's not quite behaving the way I want. Let's go ahead and check out what's going on with that here. Looks like that's the diffuse. And what I think I will do is go ahead and just put this on opacity. Aha. So what that is doing is taking that dark area and masking it out. And the actual material you're seeing on this button is the properties here, this plastic of the label itself. So I'll go ahead and set this to be just a lighter color, kind of like a mid-level. Oh, I spoke too soon. That's actually the, I'm sorry, that's the material on this button. Let's go to the labels, label properties. That's what I was looking for. Now let's grab this guy and drag it up. So now we can have a button that's more of like a gray. Let's go for like a dark gray. Darker. Okay. Cool. So we got this guy, and then let's go ahead and maybe just apply one more label. Again, we kind of have to consider how much time we have, but if I take my USB here and drag this onto the face, just apply it as a label. Let's go ahead and center this on the part, and just drag this guy way down. And it's going to be similar to what I just did. So I'm going to make this guy something like, do 5 millimeters. And then let's make it smaller, go 3, 4. Cool, okay. And then I'm going to bring this on over to opacity. So now I've got that material. I can go to its label properties. I can go into here and set this at, I think I had 30 for the color. And similar thing going on as we have for our power button. And if I go into my label texture, I can, if I need to, I can just move this on over a bit. So it's right next to that port. And very cool thing we can do is, if we want, we could just go ahead and duplicate this label. And I can move one of them over. So if I hit move, I'll just move this on over here to be next to the other port. And if I grab my labels, I can just swap out my flash icon, and boom, it just inherits all the properties of the other label. Pretty cool. So now we're rocking and rolling. If we want to make this a little fancier, we can hold Alt and drag this guy on over to the bump channel. And it's hard to tell, but if we get nice and close, we can see that we're definitely getting a slight bump on the edge with a little highlight. That could be pushed out a little bit further if we really wanted it to, just by going down to the bump and setting the bump height to something like 2, because this is such a small graphic. See, now we're catching the highlights. It looks pretty good. So I'll go ahead and do it on the other one too. Click on bump, and then set the bump height to 2. And I forgot to do that on this guy here. So we'll double click on the button, go to labels, Alt, drag this over to bump, and go down to the bump height and set this to 2. Very good. So we've got our labels, we've got some textures. Last thing, if you ask me, is to just examine this material here. If this needs a bit of a texture, I could go into textures. I want to use a roughness texture. So once again, I'll pop into the material graph, and I'll change this material from diffuse to plastic because we want this to be a bit shiny. And then what I want to do is get a texture, and maybe I'll do like a bit of a, let's go crazy, let's go camouflage. I know what you're thinking, this seems weird. Let's go ahead and dial this back down to be tiny, like 2, or no, let's go way smaller, 0.5. There we go. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna take the black, just make it not quite so black, so we have less contrast here. There we go, okay. And then what this is going to do is, if I go into, looks like my scale, there we go. So if I take this and plug this into the roughness, all right, so we have different kind of roughness values. I can blend it a bit if I click mix colors. And if I go to the spray and drag this guy way up, it's gonna kind of make this more fuzzy, go up pretty high. And last but not least, if that's too much contrast still, we can get a color adjust in between these. Take our contrast down. We could also bring our value down if we need to, so it's not so rough. Because if we preview this, we're seeing that we're getting, here we'll kill the saturation so it's not confusing. The lighter this color is going into roughness, the rougher it's going to be. The darker this texture is, the smoother or shinier it's going to be, the glossier. So if I bring my value down, we'll reflect a little bit more light, and we'll get more of a contrast in our gradient from the brightness here to the darker back there. So I go down in value, it's getting brighter. So we can play with those. And then lastly, we can go to our plastic and take our specular value, and we can drop this if that's just overall too bright for our scene, if it's competing with the product that's on top. And of course, we still haven't even messed with this, but we could go into our black and drop it yet to make it even darker. So lots of fun stuff we can do with this. Okay, we have to move on. I get sucked into materials. If we go back to our slideshow, we can see that I might want to try some multi-materials. I'll just show you how that works real quick. If I double click on my shell and I go into multi-materials, I can say duplicate the material and link its textures, this third one. And then what I can do is I'll do that a couple times, and then I'll just click on this and change the color. Bam, super bright yellow, so it's too much. But I could drag that down if I needed to. This also tells me that my light might be a little bit strong if I'm getting, if it's blowing out at that dark of a color. I could play with that if I had to. I could also go into this other one. I could try a different one like a pink or red or something, or a blue. So lots of fun stuff we can do with this here. I kind of like that. I think I'll stick with that for now. Go ahead and hit OK. And then we can play with these, you know, if we want to examine different colors, maybe instead of a yellow, I can go with like a cool, like a dark green or something like that. Sort of a minty green. And then, of course, we need to see what's next. So here we want to choose a direction and proceed. Now we do final adjustments. So this is where we dial in our composition, which means things like avoiding tangents where the edges or the silhouettes or horizontal or vertical lines seem to come very close to being collinear. That's very distracting to the eye. We can also play up the rule of thirds or have more kind of white space or whatever we need to do. We can also say maybe rotate our product, whatever we need to do to kind of make it more interesting. Then we want to fine tune our camera settings. This means things like add depth of field, maybe rotate the camera a little bit, just make it look as nice as possible. We tweak the lighting, dial in how bright our light is, make sure we have enough contrast, or maybe our sharp shadows or soft shadows. We can even add color to the lighting if we want to do that for some more interest. And then finally, the materials that we have, we want to maybe go in and finalize any little settings to really control and convey the surface quality of all those materials. So I'm going to move on into our scene and take a look at that. I mentioned the light being a bit bright. If I go back to my scene and in my plane, 1500 lumen, let's knock this down to 1000. And all of a sudden my color's looking a lot better. I'm still getting the bright white highlights without losing all the color and blowing out this image. So that right away tells me my light was indeed probably a little too bright based on its distance and size. What about my cube? Got an idea. These edges are pretty sharp. I wonder if I can click on my cube, go to properties, find my rounded edges, maybe just bring this up a little bit to see if I can't soften those edges. Let's do like 2 millimeters. So that softens it too much. I want to go down to say 1. There we go. Cool. And then let's take a look at, so I like how this is going to like pretty much pure darkness here. I think the side of this cube could maybe get a little bit more light. We'll see about that. And then the shadow is pretty nice, but if I wanted to adjust the size of the shadow, or the sharpness of the shadow, in case anyone's curious, I could go to my light, move the part, and I need to scale it either up or down. But here's the thing, if I do it from here, it's going to bring the light closer to the object. I want to reset my pivot, and now I could grab the yellow square or cube and drag it down. So if I make it really small, that shadow will sharpen right up, which I know a lot of people struggle with. It's pretty cool like that. I'll soften it just a bit. If it's too sharp, it doesn't look very realistic, I don't think. But the larger your object, the softer your shadow is going to be. And then I'm going to go ahead and move it again, but I want to go ahead and pick that pivot so it's back on my object. So now if I want, I can go ahead and rotate or move it up and down. And this will also have an effect on where that shadow goes, how long it is, all those good things. If I had time, I could set up another light to just throw some local lighting down here, or I could modify the HDRI to do that, which maybe I'll do. Rotate that light plane just a little bit to have a better direction of that shadow. Or if I'm really curious about getting that nice gradient and the lighting across the surface here, I could go and play with that the other direction. Maybe it's not quite as overhead. Maybe it's higher overhead. I can kind of rotate my light. Yeah, so you just play with those settings to really just get it to look the way you like. Again, time is really going to be the limiting factor here today. If I want to play with composition, I can go ahead and grab my power bank, hit the move tool, and just kind of move this guy around in here if I want to get it just a little bit closer. I said tangents earlier, by the way. This would be a tangent. See how the edge is coming right up to the edge of my frame? That's very uncomfortable. So you want plenty of breathing space, or you want to crop your image, not somewhere in between. So I'm going to choose to let this be chopped off a little bit. That's fine. And I kind of rotated my power bank so that these stripes are not going super perfectly like across my screen. And then I think I'll move it forward toward the edge maybe just a bit. And then we have, say, maybe a camera adjustment. If we need to do that, we can go into our camera and finally say like, okay, I still want that to be cropped a little bit better. Maybe I want to bring the camera in just a bit closer. So I'm really drawing attention to this part of our product. If this needs some roughness now, I can go to this material, add just a dash of roughness, 0.05 we'll say. That definitely helps that surface not look quite so weird. And then if these labels were too dark, I could go back into the material here, pop into the labels. Remember, it's the label material that's driving our color. So I can bring this up to say now 50. Because remember, before our light was really bright, that was making them look whiter than it should have. So I'll do the same thing with the other material or label. Go up to 50. Sorry if I'm going a bit quick. There's just a lot to go through today. So go ahead and bump this up, 50. Very cool. Awesome. And our light's showing us kind of that bump that we're getting on those labels. I think that's looking really nice. Last but not least, we could get into this material just a teeny bit more, pop open the material graph. We have a stack of stuff. This is because we made a multi-material. If I click this button here, it will align those. And the one that's red is the one that we currently are editing. So if I go to my color to number, we'll see that these values are driving that roughness again. I might want to go and just play with that a little bit more to see if I can take the black, the shiny part, make it glossier, just for the sake of contrast in the rendering. And then I could take my roughness down or up. Looks like it's going to look better if I go even further in the rough direction. And my bump is, I think, a little high. So I'm going to go to my texture, double click it, find my bump, set to 3. Let's try 2. And there we don't have quite so much weirdness going on the edge here, where it's getting a little bit stretched and skewed. Very good. Okay. And then if I want, because these are all a multi-material and the textures are linked, if I wanted to still assess any of these other colors, I could. And those changes I just made to the texture are staying true. And there's our kind of all black version, which kind of looks nice now. So if I like this, then I can proceed with this. Let's check our camera finally. Let's make sure we save because we moved those camera angles. But before I do that, I'm going to add some depth of field. Click on this little guy. Everything goes blurry. I'm going to click set focal point, and I want to click on where I want the part to be most in focus. I think the face of the product is the most important, so I'll click on it. We can see in the real-time view, the geometry view. The blue plane is where it's in focus, and then if I increase the f-stop, the depth of field gets bigger because we're putting more space between these, and now things start to come into focus. And this looks pretty cool, I'd say. I like the heavy depth of field look in this image, so I think we're going to proceed with this. And we're getting a little bit of noise or white fireflies on here, so I'll double click this material. Actually, this is the next step. Let's go ahead and make sure our camera is indeed saved. We'll lock it. And actually, before I lock it, I'll call this one render. All right, and then now I'll lock it. Okay, about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to try to zip on through. We're almost done here. Cool, so render settings. Let's talk about these. We're going to use our real-time region render to decide on how many samples to render at. We want to adjust material samples if certain materials need a little bit more TLC, meaning if they're looking too noisy or if they have too many fireflies, we can work on that. We can set our resolution for our final rendering and then our final rendering quality. So Getting back into here, I think I'm done with my geometry view. I'll close this out. And then what I'll do is notice the fireflies here. What I was going to do is double click on this and say, hey, I want to increase my material samples. Here's the interesting thing. We can't because this is a basic plastic. So let's make this a transparent plastic. And I know this sounds very counterintuitive, but transparent plastic has a sample setting under the roughness property that we want to adjust. So I click the expand button, and I'm going to crank the samples here to something like 16 instead of 12, and that should help with that a little bit. May not see it so much in the real-time view, not immediately at least, but it will work. Now, interestingly enough, we're starting to see through this. Be careful when you switch to a transparent plastic because specular transmission adopts the color white by default. So I want to set this to black, which means no light can move through that material. Go ahead and hit save. And now we're back to where we were with that material, and its settings are higher, so it's going to render a little bit better. That's a very vague way of saying that, but it's or basic way of saying that, but it's true. And then I'm going to do kind of the same thing here. Set this to black and set my sample settings to something about 16. And lastly, this should be fine on this material. If I go into my, I'm going to take my refractive index. If I drop this down a little bit, we should notice that this looks less shiny again. I kind of like this gradient to go back to a darker color. So if we were to break the rules of physics and play with this and start messing with this, we could make it shinier or less shiny and kind of drive or direct the eye as we will, or as we want. One other thing I forgot, I wanted some more light on the side of this cube. So if I pop into my environment, check this out, in the HDRI editor, I can add a pin. Actually, you know what? There's a better way of doing that. I'm gonna add, I'll trash that. I'm gonna add a highlight, hold Control or Command and click on the cube side that I want to put the light on. If I brighten that up, go about 10, we have light on the side here. So I'll do about 30. And the reason that this is having to go so bright is because I turned my entire environment down. And as far as the brightness goes, I could have just turned, say, the background down instead of the overall environment. So let's do that. I'll go bring the environment up to 1, brightness, and then the HDRI editor, click on the background, grab this brightness down. I think at 0.135 or something is what I had. So now we're back to where we were. This light can be made, this pin can be made a bit smaller and certainly not as bright. And I can, again, click to kind of reposition that if I need to. Still getting a bit noisy. Maybe with my depth of field, it's not going to look quite as good as I want. So maybe I abandon that idea. That's all right. Let's go to our lighting tab. I'm in basic still. Product is where it's at. If you want to ensure that most of your renderings are going to look pretty good, product is the safest way to go. That's a very blanket statement. It's not always the case, but most people, if you're rendering transparent materials or you want to get a few more ray bounces, global illumination is something that makes stuff look pretty realistic. Again, at the risk of oversimplifying things, I suggest rendering in product mode. This is going to set your real-time sampling to behave this way. For this scene, I certainly don't need 14 ray bounces, so I can drop this to like, I don't know, about 5. That will certainly speed up this rendering. You need a ray bounce every time light moves through a transparent surface. So in this case, I don't need very many. Just having a few helps the scene not get too many like black areas, so to speak. Okay, this is pretty good. I'm happy with this. Let's go to our render settings. At this point, I tend to save. I'll save one more time, and then I'll check out my render settings here. We've got to name our thing. I'll call it power bank black, or maybe I want to render all those multi-materials. I'll just leave it called power bank. Set my rendering format to PNG. There's other reasons to use these other formats, but for basic image today, we're just going to go PNG. 1920 by 1080 is the standard resolution I render at, so I'll leave it as is. If I want to go in later and make some tweaks in Photoshop or something to the brightness or like the side, like the cube or anything like that, I could make this easier on myself and output like a normals pass or a clown pass if I wanted to. So I can check those on. These are freebies. These don't make your rendering take any longer. And then last but not least, how are we going to render max samples, max time, or custom control? Well, I'm liking the way this looks. I'll use max samples. I really want these white things to clear up, so I'm going to get a region render. I go to image, click region, and I'm going to resize this box to focus on the problematic area of my rendering where I'm getting those white spots. And hopefully with enough time, those should go away. And if they still don't, maybe I need to dial in some of my render settings just a bit. Let's go ahead and take the refractive index of this down just a touch, take our specular down just a touch, and maybe take my roughness up a fair bit because those are still distracting me. So that stuff should help make this a little bit less noisy. And then as I let this sit, if I hit the H key, I get my heads up display. We see samples increase over time. So samples, this is going to be the measure of like the clarity or the quality or the cleanliness of the final rendering. So I let this sit for a second until I think it looks good to my eye visually here. And when it looks good enough, I look at the number of samples and then I decide to type that into my samples settings for my final rendering. And that will ensure that the whole image has this quality of resolution. And if I'm left with any hot spots left or any fireflies, I can take care of those in post. It's not the end of the world. I'm focused on speed. I want to get in and out instead of tweaking lights and materials forever. So at this point, since I have depth of field on, I might sit somewhere around 500 samples. It's on the high side, but if I really want that smooth depth of field and just really want to be sure that things look nice, I'll go ahead and use that number. So I'll type in 512, and then honestly, that's it. So I can, let's delete this old job, and let's go ahead and I can either add the current job. So when I'm ready to go, I can process this in the render queue, or better yet, I can go to add multi-material and I can add all three of these multi-materials. So if I select them all, I can add them all, and it shows 3 frames, and it will actually render the same image 3 times, one with each color. Pretty cool. And then I just hit process queue and I'm done. I can go get a coffee or take a break or go to lunch or something like that. So really, that's it. That's the beginning to end sort of process. And pop over to here. That puts us right at Q&A. It's 10:53. So demo took a while, but I'm glad we made it through it. Hopefully questions were answered. Hopefully that's useful. I'm going to leave this slide up. And then I will let Rex or Josh or whoever's on the line feed me a few questions if that sounds good. And based on time, I'll try to either answer or demonstrate those in the KeyShot panel. So if you guys got to go, thank you for attending. And for those who are sticking around, Q&A time.
Hey, Will, great job. Thank you for that. We only had a few questions today. One of those questions was from Will, and he just left. He was asking about the material roughness of the particular scene you're working on. But there were a couple other questions that could be worth answering here. One by John Mirish is, can a label be turned into a light?
Good question. Sure. So I assume the question having to do with a label being turned into a light. Let's say we want this to look like an kind of co-molded or 2-part material, and you want light to emit out of the power button or something to show it's charging or on. Yes, the short answer is yes. So if I double click on this material, the way to do that is actually remembering that labels, they're actually just a layered material, one on top of the other. So this, if I turn off my opacity, this is just a gray label applied, or a gray plastic material that's on top of this button. This little texture is what's actually keeping it to this area. It's masking it out so it only shows up here. If I want this to appear to be a light, I could go to my materials and change this into something like an emissive material. And by doing that, what this says is this is an emissive material. Its color is this. So if I want it to be like a blue LED, set this to blue. And set the brightness, just crank this up as high as I need to. So if I want this to be like 5, it's going to look almost so bright that it's like white. If I bring this back down, I can bring it into the color realm again. And then as far as getting this to output light, I know a lot of people often want some glow or some bloom here. Your options are to either check out the effects. You can turn this on. A little bit of bloom radius will kind of get this to glow a bit. Maybe it works in a scene like this because I have depth of field on already. But if you're finding that this is giving you too much glow, you can try to mess with it or bloom. I will mention just around the corner, KeyShot 8 will have a super awesome extra slider here that allows us to keep the bloom or the glow to the brightest areas only and offers way better control than you can do with this currently. But those are the options. Hopefully that answers the question well enough.
Yeah, totally. And that slider is called Bloom Threshold for KeyShot 8, and yeah, that's going to be a good one. It's simple but very powerful. Yeah, so just to recap that, you can assign an emissive material to a label, right? But you cannot use any of the actual light source materials. So yeah, that definitely answers the question. And then just one more that maybe you can touch on a bit. A little bit unrelated, Jason was asking about mapping wood textures, but he said he has trouble with the seams of wood textures, and you mentioned with the mesh procedural that maybe you would have difficulty going around that radii there. So maybe you can just quickly show how to use the triplanar mapping when mapping a traditional texture to have access to that blend seams parameter, so you can smooth out those seams along the radii.
Yeah, that's a good question. So if I go ahead and just create a new plastic on top of here, and I grab a traditional wood texture. So again, these materials in here, the procedural ones, they will have no problem mapping around round stuff like this. They're 3D procedural textures. The traditional materials, however, can be a bit more challenging because they use 2D textures. So if I go into my 2D texture, grab this ash, and I drag it onto here as we'll just go to diffuse, and we see it will be set to box mode, box mapping. If I go and let's go ahead and throw in another environment really quickly just to make it easier to see. We can see that the edge has a nasty seam. Kill depth of field here. I have to unlock my camera to do that. Just go to the free camera, and then if I throw this in a performance mode, we'll really see it. This edge or seam is pretty distracting. So in our material graph, we got all sorts of stuff going on. I will simplify this by just killing the multi-material, going back inside, and here we go. So we have our ash, our texture, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring one of these guys. Actually, I won't do that yet. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to add a texture triplanar. And what this does is this allows me to load a traditional texture. If I double click triplanar, if I go to projection, I can drag this into that. And what that will do is it places it on just like we had, but you'll notice the blend seams up top is set to 1. If I turn that down to 0, we get that seam. If I turn this up, we start to blend that, and it becomes much less noticeable. So if you push it, your eye, I mean, you know, it's not perfect, but your eye can see past that. The other thing is this is going the direction we maybe don't want it to. So what I could do is figure out, let's see, I don't know if this is totally necessary, but just to be sure, I'm placing the same one in all 3. And then if I grab one of these angles and I start playing with it, I should be able to rotate. It looks like this one's not going to do anything. Hopefully this one will. Yeah, so there's a top one. So if I set that to 0, that means the first one here was the X. So I could take this and set this X to 90. And now this texture is aligned with the texture on top, and they're blending, and we're not going to get a seam. So quite a bit you can do there. I would say that's a super, super sleeper feature. It's like a tongue twister, but most people don't know about that, and that can hopefully help out you the next time you need to get kind of a smooth blend of textures on a more complex curvy shape like this. How's that do, Rex?
Totally, that was great. And actually, you made it a little more difficult than it needs to be. So why don't you go ahead and reapply the ash material from the library?
Just straight up from here?
Yep.
Okay.
So you can go in and edit the texture mapping type and change it to triplanar. The type drop down, so just above where it says texture map, change that to triplanar, and then it maintains, or it should have maintained that the mapping of that ash node.
I wonder performance mode has anything. Nope. Well, in that case, I can still prove that it behaves the same way.
Yeah, and then as long as you have a texture plugged into one of those paths, it's going to read that same texture for the other two projections.
Totally makes sense.
But you can map them independently if you have a different grain for the side of a board or something like that. But yeah, super sleeper feature indeed.
Cool.
So yeah, just after 11 here today, I think that was great. You did mention that KeyShot 8 feature, the bloom threshold, if that's interesting to anyone, or if any of you on the webinar would like to check out KeyShot 8 beta and see what else is new, just send an email to beta@luxion.com and we can get you set up with a temp license so you can jump into KeyShot 8 and give it a shot for yourselves. So yeah, I think that's it for today. Go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, awesome. Appreciate your help there, Rex. Everybody, thank you for attending. Hopefully this was helpful. If you want to learn more about KeyShot, check out youtube.com/KeyShot3D for more tips, tutorials, and webinars. And hopefully we'll see you here again soon. Have a good day, everybody.